Good evening and welcome to SDS Thursday. As always, presented to you by SDS Seminars. We are a UK-based training company specializing in continuous professional development for psychologists, psychotherapists, counselors, CBT therapists, for people in therapy profession. My name is Dr. Julia Budnik, and I'm one of the directors of SDS Seminars. And my co-director, Paul Grantham, is going to be our presenter today. And today's topic is going to be positive psychotherapy, a topic which is not touched upon very often nowadays. So we felt it would be a good opportunity to talk to you about it. While we're still gathering, I will ask you, as always, to start typing and to tell us a little bit about yourself in the chat box, whatever you think is appropriate. First of all, we are always interested where you are in the world, where you're joining us from. We're also asking whether you've been to SDS Thursdays before or whether it is your first time, and whether you've been to any of our events, training events, recently or a long time ago, whether you've been to our training on positive psychotherapy or any other resource-based therapies, solution-focused therapy, motivational interviewing. We'll be talking a little bit about what is in common between these different therapeutic approaches. So also what setting you're working in. Are you working with adults, with children, private practice, NHS, charity, whatever's appropriate, and whether you are using positive therapy or positive psychology at all in your therapy, or whether you are completely new to it. So all these things are always of interest to us. And while we are still gathering, because I know that people usually coming at the last moment or even after we've started, I will try to share my screen with you. I know I've had problems with it lately, but last 3 meetings I've managed to share the screen and it was okay. So I'll try to do it now. As always, I'm sharing my screen to show you our website. So this is SDS Seminars website. To find it, you type SDS Seminars into Google. Or if you are very skilled at that, you put skillsdevelopment.co.uk. Or you scan the QR code, which I will put here for those who watch us on YouTube. You can just scan it right from the screen and you'll get to our website. And just to show you a little bit how this website is organized, you have 3 upcoming events. So these are events which are coming up very soon before the summer, or you can click on all courses and see our most popular courses. Here they are sorted in terms of popularity, and you can see that positive psychotherapy is one of the most popular courses with SDS Seminars. And we haven't run it live for quite a while, and we've decided to run it again simply because we felt we needed to update it and share some new developments in the field with you. So another option, you can click on calendar view, and here you see all the courses up to 2024, November even 2024. We already have some courses planned, and see what catches your interest. So today we are talking about June, and in June we are running clinical supervision course on the 6th and 7th of June, and I'll tell you a secret. Paul is going to run that course from Japan. So we'll see how he'll manage doing it in the middle of the night when in Japan.
And that was me hoping I could do that soon.
Yes. So he'll be doing it in the middle of the night. He's there for a conference. and he will be running that course from Japan. But actually, he'll be running positive psychotherapy from Japan as well. And probably he'll pick up some interesting new approaches from Japanese people there. So it'll be very interesting. Okay. So that's the course which we'll be talking about today. Okay, Paul, are you ready to start?
Yeah, far away. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's start with quite a logical question. What is positive psychotherapy? Is it a separate modality? How it came about? And why are you teaching it?
Okay, so if I can take the sort of last question first is probably the best way of saying it. So I'm sure a number of you are aware of this already, but for those of you that aren't, this is one of 3 modules in the BPS approved certificate in resource-based therapies. The previous 2 that we've run live, but which are also available to you as recordings as well, were on motivational interviewing and beyond, and also solution-focused brief therapy. So this is the 3rd module. The other 2 were 2 days in length. This one is 1 day in length. And they share certain things in common. Although it's probably fair to say that they share slightly less in common than the other 2 modules do. But let me just go through what the commonalities are really, because it explains why we're running it. I think all of these modules in the resource-based therapist certificate are really about helping people to flourish. So they are all about basically, for want of a better term, becoming better individuals in some particular way. And so that tends to mean that they are all very future oriented. And generally speaking, they are not particularly interested in people's pasts. And certainly there are some instances where we can happily touch on that, but generally speaking, it has got certain advantages. So it's got undoubtedly distinct advantages when you're working with people that do not wish to go into detail about their past or find it difficult to talk about their problem, or maybe don't think they've got a problem even, or certainly don't want to see it as something which is their responsibility to deal with. So that's one thing. I think certainly what is the case around most or the vast majority of psychotherapeutic modalities is they all tend to be what's called pathology based. So they all tend to be about starting off with a definition of the problem that someone has, and that basically the therapy, in inverted commas, is about filling the gaps in whatever those particular deficits are. You know, whether we're talking about a modality which talks about historical poor parenting, for example, or whether we're talking about a modality that focuses on a skills deficit that someone has. But in both of those instances, although they are very, very different in terms of their underlying assumptions, they both start off with the idea that the client has a deficit of some particular type. And obviously a large amount of language that's used around in those therapeutic approaches reflects that particular belief. So there's a massive emphasis, for example, in most modalities on the value of assessment. That is not seen as being particularly central in any of the modules that we're going to work with, including the positive psychotherapy module. It is also not especially concerned with having a detailed understanding of how we map someone's past experience onto their current problems. So in that particular respect, and I know this will sound potentially horrifying to some of you, there is no key role, at least for case formulation at all with these 3 approaches. But for me, what's most important, and for those of you that have not been along to any of the previous modules, I won't say much on now, but it's the thing that's probably primarily driven me, is that I think that basically a deficits model and a deficits approach to helping people to change fundamentally at the end of the day goes around in circles. The more you actually concentrate on deficit and shortcoming or damage or whatever it is that you want to call this, the more you get forever drawn back to it. And there's a whole variety of reasons for that. But it's one of the reasons, for instance, that we have an absolutely massive increase in the number of folks like you and me who are working with people with psychological problems today. The last data that I actually got, for instance, just on the profession of counsellors, that I got from an organization, by the way, that's always worth having a look at because the quality of its data is so good, which is an organization called Statistica, indicated that there are currently 400,000 counsellors operating in the UK. Let me just repeat that, 400,000. Now, there's also been massive expansions in statutory services, which incidentally, can I just emphasize, everybody says is not enough. But having said that, what I'm basically saying is more and more resources does not solve the problem if we are basically approaching the problem in the wrong way. And I think very often one of the biggest difficulties that's around really with a deficit-based model is the focus on deficit rather than the focus on strengths and resources. And all of these three approaches basically all give a big emphasis to personal strengths and to the resources that individuals bring along. So that's how it fits into the overall certificate. In terms of its difference, I think, from the other two modules, this is an approach to helping people which is basically, first of all, extremely evidence-based driven. So in that respect, it follows in the tradition of certain modalities, of which I guess the most obvious is CBT, and to a lesser extent, motivational interviewing, where the way to go, in inverted commas, what is seen as best practice in inverted commas, is typically determined by outcome research, with using particular types of intervention. And certainly I think that empirical basis for it is one of the things that marks it out as being slightly different from solution-focused work and also motivational interviewing. Not that I wish to suggest that those do not have an empirical basis to them. They do. It's just the degree of detail and the amount of it is actually much more limited. So in that respect, it's different. And it's probably also fair to say that its broad approach probably borrows most heavily from second and third wave CBT. So, for instance, it does give a reasonable amount of emphasis to the use of practical exercises to use with clients, which clients are also strongly encouraged to practice. Very, very similar to a skills-based model that you might actually get with certain other modalities, except in this particular instance, it's not a skill that requires you to identify as having a problem or a deficit in order to get a benefit from it, which I guess inevitably leads some people to say, well, what's its purpose then? And its purpose is very straightforward. Its purpose is to actually grow personal well-being and to grow personal strengths. So in that respect, I hope you can see that it's got particular use if you've got a problem or you have deficits, but it doesn't require you to have a problem. It doesn't require the client to agree with us about what the problem actually is. It's still very, very usable and very, very useful. There's an enormous amount of outcome literature, and although generally speaking, I've kept on top of developments in the field over a number of years, it's really only been this year when I decided I wanted to rerun it that I thought I'd better go into the research literature in a lot more detail. And I will be absolutely honest with you, I have been staggered, absolutely staggered about the mushrooming of new research, primarily new research, that's occurred, particularly I think over the last probably 7 or 8 years. And that's one particular thing. There's also been some new developments as well, new areas that have been either identified or alternatively, which have been massively expanded. And depending on how our time is today, I might say a little bit about 1 or 2 of those particular areas. I'd like to just put in a personal plea, how about this, because I will say to you now, when I started going through the research, I was a bit surprised, if I'm really honest with you, that I was not more aware of it. In other words, it was a little bit of a shock to me in terms of the amount of empirical, theoretical research, the amount of outcome research, and also, can I say, the amount of, or the number of projects that have been set up using positive psychotherapy and which have been evaluated, and yet I was not aware of. And there is, unfortunately, a reason for this, which is probably no different now than it was when I first got involved in this field over 10 years ago, which is that there is a particular issue around in the UK psychological psychotherapy field, which is that in the UK, we are particularly dominated by basically deficit models and deficit approaches. It comes through probably more clearly now than it ever did before because of the incredible emphasis on diagnosis. Diagnosis being a categorization which is used frequently and increasingly frequently for referral. It's used increasingly by statutory services. It's used increasingly as well by insurance companies, et cetera, and also it's increasingly an integral part of a lot of the outcome measures that are used. The situation in the States has always been different because I think that there is an underlying culture in the States which, I'm not talking about how it's actually manifested, but certainly in terms of a value system in the States, which has always seen the idea of personal development and personal flourishing as being an integral value in its own right. And I think that's really shown because when I've actually gone through the research in the field, there is some research that's being done within the UK. Interestingly enough, and if I can just say this, although there is some, it's relatively thin on the ground. And it's only being done, can I hasten to add, first of all, in the education field or with children, which incidentally is always historically, until recently, to be honest with you, been that area of psychological difficulty where diagnosis has never really played a massive role. But that is now changing for a whole variety of reasons, and I'm sure any of you that are working with children or young people will already be aware of that. But so there's been some work done there in the education field, and it's also been very, very heavily adopted as well by people working with organizations and people who are involved in coaching. But I hope you notice that those tend to be outside of the field of, for want of a better term, personal difficulties or personal psychological problems. As soon as you start looking at work that is being done specifically, I would argue, within the NHS, which is particularly driven by deficit diagnostic categories, you will find there's near enough a total absence of it. And that's quite interesting because I wouldn't say that that divorce between positive psychotherapy, for example, and CBT, which is obviously the most dominant and understandably dominant modality within the NHS, that divorce between the two does not exist in the States. So anyone, for example, who keeps up with Christine Podesky's work, for example, from the US, which is CBT based, will find that she incorporates a lot of positive psychotherapy ideas within the work that she actually does. But that does not seem to cross over to the work that's actually being done very often within the UK. And can I just say, if there are some of you here this evening who are saying, well, it's not like that where I work, we use a lot of this where I work, and it's a statutory service, and it's an NHS-based service, I genuinely would love to hear from you. Because I think that this work, particularly within the UK, needs to be promoted a lot more. So sorry for that slight ramble there, but that's the reasons where it both fits in, I guess, to the overall certificate, and also the reason why I think it's particularly important overall because it is, you're quite right, Julia, as you said earlier, it commonly gets ignored and you do not hear a lot of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. You've demonstrated perfectly how to anticipate questions and to answer them before they were asked, because there
will be a lot more, I can guarantee.
There were so many points I wanted to ask, and you said and answered all these questions, but I would like to sort of drill slightly deeper
Sure.
some of them. Well, let's start with the certificate which you mentioned, resource-based therapies. So it includes solution-focused therapy,
yeah,
motivational interviewing,
and beyond.
And beyond, exactly, and positive psychotherapy.
Yeah.
So can I just ask a few technical questions? So if somebody is interested in positive therapy, but didn't attend solution focus or motivational interviewing, can they take that course as standalone?
Oh, undoubtedly, yes,
right.
Undoubtedly. And indeed, I should have added this as well. It is, because there are so many standalone techniques within positive psychotherapy, it's not essential to actually have any prior theoretical background. So although there are elements of it which are influenced by CBT, there are elements of it. Nonetheless, it requires no CBT knowledge, and in many ways it's fundamentally different from CBT, but it's just that there's an influence on it. But people don't need any of that background. Interestingly enough, what I would say is that when you dig a bit deeper into some of the positive psychotherapy process elements, you know, how do I conduct X with my client? How do I phrase it? What order should I do things in? Those sorts of process questions, you will actually find that positive psychotherapy, and this is just from my immediate experience of it, borrows very heavily indeed from solution focus type questions, and it also borrows quite heavily from some concepts in ACT as well, but it doesn't require any knowledge of those approaches. These are sort of cherry-picked questions that you can actually use without having any further background in the approaches. Okay.
Well, let me ask you further. Okay, I hear what you say, that it works sits particularly well with CBT, with ACT, and Podesky uses lots of techniques and so on. But if I'm a CBT therapist or a counselor or relationship counselor, and I know my field, why would I go and learn positive psychotherapy?
Right.
I know what I'm doing, I'm good at it. Why I need this?
Okay, I'll try and answer this as briefly as possible. Some very brief background. There's a concept called selective attention, which some of you may or may not be aware of. But one of the downsides of selective attention is that whatever we selectively attend to, we find ourselves orientating towards and moving towards it, even if our primary aim is to overcome it. And there's lots of stuff that typically I've gone over before in previous trainings on why that's actually the case. But one of the implications of it is that if we spend our time with our clients focusing on the problem all the time, it actually leads the individual to come back to the problem all the time, even when they're actually trying to overcome it. I give lots of examples of that. This is not just a psychological process, by the way, in terms of therapy. It's actually an attentional and perspective issue, which crops up in all sorts of instances. So basically what I'm saying is if you have issues with your clients where basically it feels like it's not moving forward or it goes around in circles, or, and I think this is another big issue incidentally, where you have clients who tend to be rather vulnerable to relapse, then actually I think that you need to be looking at another approach, at the very least, to add on to what it is that you're actually doing, which gives a different focus. And I don't think that that actually happens for many people automatically. And I'll say why I don't think it happens automatically, because most clients, when they first come to us, when we say to them, how would you like things to be different? What would you like to get out of therapy or whatever? Most clients will actually give us what's called a negative goal. They'll say things like, well, I'd like not to be depressed. I'd like not to be arguing with my partner. I'd like not to be anxious. I'd like not to be afraid of going out, whatever it actually is, but it's a negative goal. And broadly speaking, you cannot, unfortunately, focus on negative goals. Because, well, actually you can. Sorry, actually what I should say is if you focus on negative goals, that's all you end up seeing. I think it's also, by the way, compounded by an exclusive emphasis on past history. Because to make a very obvious point, my past history is the one thing I can't change. So really, at the end of the day, if we spend all of our time looking at that in whatever shape or form, there's a danger that actually whatever it is, whatever else we're trying to do, it tends to lead us to go back basically to that. So that's one reason, which is that basically all of these approaches enable us to have and enable the client to have a positive goal, a positive focus about where it is they wish to move to. And one of the great things about positive psychotherapy is it doesn't necessarily have to involve the opposite of the problem. So let me just explain this. I could say to my client, how would you like things to be different? My client says to me, I'd like not to be depressed. I then say, how would you like to be feeling instead? And they give me an answer, and that becomes a therapeutic goal. Although the way I've just described that, which makes it sound dead simple, can I say, do not be surprised if your clients really struggle with trying to identify what the alternative to the problem actually looks like. With positive psychotherapy, you don't have to worry about that. So to give you a particular example, if you look at the use of gratitude exercises, for instance, which is one of the techniques that has been developed and has had a lot of work done on it within positive psychotherapy. I don't need to necessarily either have a problem to get a benefit from that. I don't need to agree with you about what that problem actually is. If I don't want to talk about my problem, that's fine, because we don't have to do that. And one of the things that's very interesting, and I'll be honest with you, I've thought a lot about whether this is specific to positive psychotherapy or whether it applies to other modalities, but other modalities don't necessarily measure it. And I've sort of come to the conclusion, really, that it's a bit of both, but I think positive psychology does more of it, which is that positive psychology outcome measures seem to have a very big rippling out effect. Now, what I mean by that is that whatever the problem is that someone comes along with, or whatever the difficulty is, when a positive psychotherapy intervention is actually used, it creates broader improvements in a wide range of areas. Everything from improved mood, which is obviously the thing that most people are interested in when they come along, but it's been found to substantially improve relationships. It's been found to improve job satisfaction, for example. It's been found to improve what's broadly termed pro-social behavior, which I hate to describe what pro-social behavior is without talking about deficits, but it means less offending and less unwanted pregnancies. And all of these things are basically a product of doing something, and I do want to emphasize this point, which does not require talking about that problem. So if the person wants to talk about it, then that's fine, but it's not a prerequisite. And I think that is invaluable. As many of you will know, I have a particularly specialist interest in poorly motivated clients. And so this was one of the reasons why I originally got into this, because it seemed to me initially to offer so much promise. So I would say, first of all, if the work that you're doing is not giving you the results that you would like to have all the time, then I would see this as being an invaluable add-on, basically, because it will actually help to finesse or bypass, not all, but some of the problems that currently exist, I think, with other modalities when you're working with a client.
Thank you. I like to think about using of positive therapy as, if you look at the pie chart and you have a huge area of the client's life taken with the problem, you can attempt to take the problem out, but then you have to fill that gap with something else.
Yeah.
Or there's another way, is to insert something in, making the percentage which is given to the problem slightly smaller. So am I right to think
that?
Yeah,
totally. Can I also add to that, because I know the pie chart that you're thinking of. Can I add to that? One of the problems of a deficits model is we very understandably make the mistake of assuming that the client's life is the problem. In other words, the problem fills the whole of the client's life. It defines the problem. And we will often use a lot of language to reflect that as well. And I think one of the things that this approach does is it identifies that, first of all, the problem is just one part of the client. And actually, there's more bits of the client that aren't the problem than there are bits of the client that are. I mean, I won't go into the detail of that, but most of our clients spend more of their time doing things which are not affected by the problem or only minimally affected by the problem than they do things which are affected by the problem. And secondly, as you point out, one of the great dangers, of course, of concentrating solely on the problem is that if that problem is removed, and hopefully with an effective intervention or set of approaches it is removed, there's a vacuum there. And if that individual has had that problem as a part of their life for years, if not decades, what happens as a result? And broadly speaking, nature abhors a vacuum. And I came across yet another example of this the other day. In fact, it's actually the field, I hate to say this, it's the field where I come across this most commonly, although it's not the only field in which it comes up, is in the addiction and substance misuse field, where so many people are very understandably driven by a negative goal. I don't want to be using alcohol, drugs, whatever. And that somehow or other, that is taken away and they are no longer using. But there's a gap there. There's a gap. This is something which has filled the person's identity in many ways, been a substantial part of their identity. And the reason why I say it brings me back to this, because I was having a discussion earlier on in the week with someone about an issue that's always concerned me, which is what I perceive as being the rush of ex-substance users back into helping. And that in a way, it's actually in many ways an illustration of the point that I was actually making earlier, that you can't selectively attend to the absence of something because it draws you back. And what I often have asked some of the folks that I've worked with who no longer use a substance about what is it that they're doing with their time now, because very often that their time was substantially taken up with this. Not all of their time, but a substantial part was taken up. And they are frequently at a loss. Or they will say, well, I'm now volunteering, or I'm now training in something which will be related to their problem, and so on and so forth. It's very rare indeed for me to come across people, for example, to talk a lot more about activities or hobbies, which they've now spend more time on. I get some people who will talk about career aspirations as a replacement, but as soon as you actually start exploring those, I would say at least in 50% of instances of people I talk to, those career aspirations are connected back with the problem. So I think the whole idea of helping people to develop their strengths and resources in other ways, I think is really important to try and help prevent what happens to that vacuum, or to be honest with you, to prevent the vacuum occurring in the first place. And there's a lot of stuff around it in positive psychotherapy which facilitates that. If you look, for example, at the use of what's called the VIA and at signature strengths, the VIA was basically constructed originally as a typology of ways in which individuals flourish, because Marty Seligman, who initially developed this, was absolutely fed up with the fact that he, every time he was talking about people, he was having to go to DSM-4 at the time in order to describe things. And he wanted to have a classification system which was not just about problems or the absence of a problem. And so the VIA was constructed. And as a result of that, there's a particular way of helping clients to identify their signature strengths. And there's some very good interventions which have been developed regarding how individuals can use those strengths in ways that they've not been familiar with before. And all of that, I think, gives a very different tone to the type of conversation that we can have, because it clearly broadens things out. And actually, the issue of the problem doesn't become center stage. And yet, and this is the very interesting thing, in the outcome literature, the problem shrinks or disappears without actually necessarily talking about it. Now, I should add here, there are ways of doing this in a hybrid way. So for instance, if you are working with a client and the client is maybe having to practice certain things or do between session home practice or preparatory work, and that might be part of the therapy that you're actually doing, you will know the difficulties that often arise for people in terms of doing that. And yet, there's an enormous amount of work within positive psychotherapy that, for example, looks at how you can encourage and develop client perseverance and client resilience as well, which obviously is a key issue, incidentally, if you're also interested in preventing subsequent relapse. Because obviously, I'm sorry to get a bit boring about this, but this is a real bugbear of mine. We spend an enormous amount of time looking at how to help people to change. There is very little interest really in how we help people keep change going, how we facilitate what's called maintenance. And I understand the reasons for that. It becomes less of a priority for the client, problem solved, goodbye, it becomes less of a problem for us, particularly if we've got a waiting list, etc. But I hope you can inevitably see that there are problems here with relapse, or simply the individual coming across quite common life events which they are not really fully prepared for. And I think that knowing how to become more resilient, to know how to persevere, are actually two key maintenance skills, which I would challenge anybody to actually show me another source of ideas and research and practice which actually addresses that. I think that positive psychotherapy is unique in that way.
Thank you. Can I just, because you mentioned several things already, can I ask you to go like bullet points, what kind of issues you will be covering in the course? Because it sounds quite widely spread. So what issues you'll be covering? Okay.
The first thing to say is that there will be case illustration throughout. But leaving aside case illustration, it is not organized, surprisingly, on the basis of problems. It's actually organized, first of all, on the basis of a broad understanding of the assumptions of it. And we don't spend an enormous amount of time on the assumptions, but I think it's important. And on the basis of my experience, one of the earliest types of questions that tend to come my way when people first come across this is they want to know how it's going to work with such and such a problem, which I'm more than happy to do, but we're not going to organize it on the basis of problems. What we're going to primarily organize this on is on the basis of interventions. So we are going to start off primarily looking at how we can help clients identify signature strengths within what's called the CSV, and to then look at how you can use those signature strengths, or how your client can use those signature strengths in order to actually basically flourish. And I've used that term because I'll be giving some case illustrations of how, in a sense, the interventions are not directly connected with the presenting problem that the client comes along with, but the outcome of it is that the problem then diminishes. So we're going to look at using signature strengths. And just as a teaser, for those of you that are not familiar with this approach, using this approach, it does not look at the signature strengths which the individual lacks the most. So many modalities say, let's have a look at what it is that people lack in terms of strengths, and let's look at trying to train them up in that and build that up. It takes a very, very different approach to that. So I won't say anything about it now, but for those of you that aren't familiar with it, we'll be looking at that. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time we're going to be spending quite a bit of time looking at the broad issue of altruism. There is a very strong and very striking relationship between a whole range of altruistic behaviors and psychological well-being. A fact, incidentally, which has really not been picked up on at all by any other approach or modality that I've been aware of, with the possible exception of existential psychotherapy, which tends to put a lot more emphasis on value. But leaving that aside, it's not actually looked at a great deal. And the one area where we will be concentrating the most on with that, but not exclusively on it, is the issue of gratitude. And I'll be going through a particular type of gratitude exercise in detail. You'll be getting a video illustration of its use as well with a client, but I'll also be touching on other types of gratitude exercise as well, which in a sense you pay your money and you take your choice on which to use. I have a personal opinion on which I think is the best, but again, there will be a selection there that you can actually choose from. Over and above that, we are also going to be starting to look at what I know is, for some people, is going to be a really interesting area and will cause a certain degree, by the way, of skepticism. But here it goes, which is we're going to be looking at post-traumatic growth and looking at the whole issue of how trauma has positive effects as well as negative effects on people, and that it plays frequently a key role in personal development for individuals, and that this experience, I can nearly say, is universal on the basis of the research, and I think is extremely unusual. There is an automatic assumption around that all traumatic experiences are universally intrinsically bad for people. Even when experiences appear to be bad for people, when you actually approach that traumatic experience, there are other key positive things that occur from it, which typically the client is not aware of. Can I hasten to add, very often, because they are selectively attending, very understandably, to the problems that come from trauma. But what this helps people to do is to begin to reframe their experience of trauma, to actually start seeing it as giving them something, and I feel quite happy to say this, which other people have not got, and which is a benefit, and which maybe, in actual fact, they would have never have developed if it hadn't been for those particular difficult experiences. So I appreciate that's quite a controversial area, but I've found it a real, really quite liberating, really, because I do appreciate that when people have experienced traumatic or had traumatic experiences, it's very common indeed to solely look, and very understandably, to solely look at the negative effects. And actually, I was quite skeptical about this at first. I thought it was all going to be, I'll be blunt with you, very unrealistically optimistic and tree-huggy. But actually, it's got some really valuable and useful things. And when I've incorporated it into work with clients, it's really made it's played a very big role in helping people to shift the way they think about what's actually happened to them. And that, not surprisingly, has also got relevance to the whole issue of adversity, because obviously trauma is an extreme form of adversity, but it's that concept of the value of adversity is also something we'll be touching on. We're also going to be spending quite a bit of time looking at the development of resilience as well. I've mentioned the importance of this, but there's a whole body of practical work, exercises, and also research as well about how it's been developed. Again, can I just emphasize that this is not soft science, it's not pop science. And can I just offer out this rather strange, but I think rather convincing argument for why it's not the case, because this particular approach to developing resilience has been embraced by the American military for the last decade odd, and has been rolled out across the whole of the military. And they're not going to do this on the basis of something which they think is soft pop psychology. And it's got good outcome literature attached to it as well. So there's a wide variety of ideas within this, which we're going to be looking at, which have all been tested really well as well, and also some practical exercises which will enable people to take those away and start using them immediately.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, because you've mentioned how there's so many new developments and they're well-researched, good evidence base for them in positive therapy and positive psychology field, and yet it didn't cross the ocean that well. Unlike, for example, unlike mindfulness, who also sort of started in the US, but then crossed the ocean extremely well, and at some point everyone was doing something on mindfulness. Why do you think it didn't happen to positive therapy to the same degree?
Because to my knowledge, I mean, I may be out of date here, to my knowledge, although we have a couple of professorships in positive psychology in the universities in the UK, to my knowledge, we still do not have a single professor of clinical psychology who has shown any interest at all in this field. The difference with mindfulness, of course, is that Mark Williams is a professor at Oxford, or was a professor at Oxford at the time, and had actually worked as well with John Kabat-Zinn at a personal level. I think that needs to be highlighted as well. When him and John Teasdale went to discover what John Kabat-Zinn was doing in the US, and then brought it back to the UK, they were both practicing meditation in their own personal lives. So that, plus the status of where they're actually working, I think made an enormous difference. That just has not occurred here. It just has not occurred. Yeah, I think that's a great shame. I think it's a great shame. If someone knows that I'm wrong on this, please do correct me on this. But I am not aware of any of the profs that are in the UK that are doing work in this field that are actually clinically trained. Although they are using some positive psychology interventions, but they don't actually have a clinical training. I don't mean to decry what they're doing. I'm just explaining why I don't think it's gained traction in this country, really. And the same, can I say exactly the same for psychiatry and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Well, before we finish, if I am working in the NHS or in the third sector and I'm a CBT therapist or a counsellor, and I need to go to my manager and convince them that I need to come to this course. Obviously, I will not stop being a CBT therapist and I will not become suddenly a positive psychologist. But what do I say to my manager? Why do I need this training?
Well, the first thing I would say is it's been developed by the man that developed the learned helplessness theory of depression. which is one of the mainstays of CBT approaches to working with depressed people, and is probably, to be honest with you, the basic theoretical underpinning, for instance, to behavioral activation in many ways. So that would be the first thing I would actually say. I think I would also say that it uses well-evidenced interventions which operate well as standalones. So for that particular reason, they can also be integrated into existing practice. Thirdly, I would mention the point that I've made to you, I guess, in a couple of ways this evening, which is that it's just an extremely helpful add-on when you are confronted by a variety of problems with your clients, where basically the mainstay approach you've been using doesn't work. So, for example, if you are concerned about relapse, this is great to actually use. If you have got clients who are very reticent about talking about their difficulty in some particular way, this is really useful to actually use. If you've got individuals, for instance, who are just very, very sensitive indeed to the sorts of things that you might be doing in your normal therapy, this is much easier to do. For example, we know about high dropout rates, particularly with certain types of problem like OCD, using exposure. Exposure, incredibly powerful as an intervention, arguably, in my opinion, the most effective intervention that's been developed in the last century. But very often I describe it as being the equivalent of a psychotherapeutic chemotherapy, which is basically, if you can go through it, great, you get very good results. But on the other hand, particularly with OCD problems, you frequently get very high dropout rates. So, you know, if you're concerned about losing clients or you've got client compliance issues that are around, this is just a breath of fresh air because it totally and utterly bypasses those.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments in the chat box, some recommendations on the books and other courses, much appreciated. And I hope some of you will come and join us on the 13th of June on this course. If you can't make the date, you will have a full recording of the course to watch at a later stage whenever you want. And if you book quickly, you can still use an early bird discount. And for now, I want to say thank you very much to Paul for interesting answers. And you can unmute yourself and say goodbyes and thank you. And we'll see you again on the 22nd of June when Professor Andrew Reeves will join us. And we will talk about a new certificate in setting up your own private practice. Okay, thank you very much. See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care. Look after yourself.
Thank you. Bye-bye.